This is the BioCentury Show. Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury and Insights partner McKinsey & Company this September in Nashville for an R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia.
Hello and welcome to the BioCentury Show. I am Simone Fishburn, Editor-in-Chief at BioCentury, and today it is a pleasure to be joined by Jeremy Bender, CEO of Day One Biopharmaceuticals. Jeremy has ratcheted up an impressive resume across biotech, starting out with a degree from Stanford and then a PhD in microbiology and immunology from the University of Colorado, an MBA from MIT, and after that, really focusing much of his career in biotech on corporate and business development, primarily in cancer and autoimmunity. Jeremy joined Gilead in 2018 and was Vice President of Corporate Development there until September 2020, giving him some big pharma experience we'll talk a little bit about. In 2020, Jeremy joined the startup Day One as a CEO. That's a company co-founded by your now colleague, Sam Blackman, who was CMO and leads R&D and really brings I would call both a wealth of scientific and medical expertise and passion to the company. I think anybody who's interacted with Sam would say that without any hesitation.
Right.
Day One rose fast. It went from a $60 million Series A in 2020, $130 million B round in 2021, and that was followed fast by an IPO that May, which brought in $184 million. You have done some follow-ons since then, and we can talk about a priority review voucher as well. Your first product, a pan-RAF inhibitor, was in-licensed from Takeda. I think the product is now called Ojemda, and it received accelerated approval in April for pediatric low-grade glioma. That is rapid progress and speaks, in my mind, to both well-designed trials and a well-thought-out strategy. And I want to get into some of those details with you today. Let's start by talking about the origins of Day One and where you're going. I remember talking to you at the beginning, and the focus on pediatric cancers really stood out to me because so few companies are doing that. So I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about how you started out. And I see you now position yourselves as targeting cancers for all ages, which obviously includes pediatric. Is your strategy evolving? And if so, how?
First off, Simone, wonderful question that I'll get into. I want to start by thanking you for this conversation. It's great. I know we've chatted over time and gotten to know each other in the past few years, but it's really a great opportunity to sit here and talk about both Day One and my background, and I very much appreciate the kind introduction. So Day One was founded by Sam Blackman and Julie Grant, and the intent was really to find a way to invest in programs that would benefit children who are living with cancer. That was absolutely the inspiration for the company. And as the company was put together, as programs were evaluated, the initial program that we brought in is now Ojemda, approved product in relapsed or refractory pediatric low-grade glioma. One of the questions had been, well, how do we make the numbers work around investment in pediatric oncology? And the reason that that's been such a challenge is that it is, fortunately, a rare patient population. And there have been challenges to some of the clinical development strategies that other industry players have considered, at least in the past. And the view that I had coming in, and certainly that Sam and Julie did, is that any program that we bring in, we really need to develop with equal intensity in both pediatrics and adults in order to really fully invest in and realize the value of all of those programs in order to make a model work in which we're able to put children living with cancer first. That isn't easy to do because of the math on both the investment required and the potential commercial opportunities. But that's the reason that early on we focused not just on children, but patients of all ages. And you'll see that now in not just Ojemda and its development path, but also the newest program we brought into our portfolio, which is an antibody drug conjugate targeting PTK7. That program really will lead off development in adults, partly because we need to establish safety before we can go into children, and thereafter we'll develop in both populations.
So I want to follow up on some of those issues in a minute, because I think that thread of pediatric drug development, certainly in oncology, is core to you and will be core to this conversation from different angles. But I want to go specifically to Ojemda and a RAF inhibitor. That might not sound that original to people. Many have tried the mechanism. So can you talk about why that target in that population represented to you guys a first or best in class opportunity, and how you evaluated that?
Yeah, it really represents what I think of as the best of oncology drug development writ large, whether in pediatrics or in adults. And that is, right program for the right patients at the right time. In this case, after about 15 years of work looking at the molecular drivers underlying tumor growth, a group in Heidelberg established that low-grade gliomas in particular are largely, not all of them, but many of them driven by the changes in RAF, in particular, either BRAF fusions or rearrangements or V600E alterations. And that data was combined with some early work that was done at Dana-Farber profiling RAF inhibitors that had the potential to inhibit those particular alterations and had chemical properties or physical chemical properties that were both developable and led to potential clinical data to an investigator-sponsored trial called PNOC 14. That early clinical data formed the basis of our interest in this program as one that we could pursue registration for. And it really is a good example of an agent that it does have a differentiated mechanism because it is a type 2 RAF inhibitor. It inhibits both, in this case, CRAF and BRAF potently. But also it's a brain penetrant molecule that had been studied in adults, and the early clinical data from that trial at Dana-Farber led us to believe that it could be quite active in relapsed or refractory PLGG, and that led to our registrational phase 2, which is Firefly 1, that eventually supported approval this past April.
Right. I just want to be clear, because you've talked about those academic studies, but you picked the asset up from Takeda, right?
Yeah, that's right. So Dana-Farber, some investigators did work through an investigator-sponsored trial, but with drug from Takeda. So that Takeda supplied a drug for that early phase 1. And at the time that Takeda chose not to continue development of the program, we approached Takeda and in-licensed it.
Got it. So I want to stay with Ojemda for a minute, because this rapid path to approval, right, means you've also had to have had a commercial execution plan in the works, maybe even from the get-go. For companies who might be on that track, meaning wanting to commercialize their assets themselves, and we can get to that, what did this mean at an operational level? How does a small startup really build the commercial expertise to pull that off successfully? And how, I'm assuming you want to pull it off successfully, right? It's early days, I know.
I think we've been, it's our first launch, of course, Ojemda. We were approved in late April, and we had product, a new medicine in the channel 15 days later, and our early commercial efforts are going very much as I'd hoped and expected they would, and that's in large part because we have been investing in preparation for that launch here in the U.S. for some time. Best practice here is that you initiate some of the work in order to prepare for commercialization, whether you're a large or a small company, at least a couple of years ahead of that particular launch. And that's very much what we did. And even in the early days of my joining the company, which was a little bit less than 4 years ago now, I had the end in mind with respect to commercialization and really pushed for, and in the end invested in that commercial preparation. And that meant bringing on relatively senior, small group of folks who could really understand what would need to be in place in order for us to be successful in the launch. And that's across all of the key stakeholders in the system, whether it's physicians, the advocacy or nonprofit community, and of course, the FDA and other groups. And all of that work has been quite helpful in our preparation, all across all the key dimensions that are important for commercialization. That's each of the sales and marketing, it's reimbursement and access, and And I would encourage those who are considering a launch, in particular in the U.S., to start that investment early, because I do think it pays dividends and leads to a fundamental understanding of where you're commercializing. That can be very important in settings where there hasn't been commercial activity. This is one, and it gives you insights that, in the end, mean you're not as surprised once you get into the market with a new medicine.
Well, I mean, you actually, if we look at the timeline that, you were founded in 2020, so you had to be doing that during some very tough market years, right? So you had to be investing in commercialization of a product that hadn't yet made it. Did you find that to be an issue with your investors, either public or private?
Yeah, in this case, no. I wouldn't say that it was trivial, but as a private organization, we began investing in commercialization, albeit at a fairly high level and not with huge dollars. And then we've been able to consistently raise capital really since the company was founded in a way that has made us a little less capital constrained than other organizations have been. It does not mean that we're any less disciplined about that investment, but it has been an opportunity we've been able to invest in, and that's through the commitment we've had. And I would say that to date, really, our investors have not been concerned about any of that investment.
So, just one more question on this front, because for me, I find it particularly interesting, certainly knowing you beforehand. You were in a pharma or a big biotech, you were in Gilead. I know you've been in smaller companies before, so you obviously have a very rounded view. But at Gilead, your role was, a lot of, licensing with small companies, licensing assets, because you as the pharma partner would take it over the finish line, because that's the general model. Now, you've gone completely 180 on that with yourself. You've decided to commercialize the product yourself rather than partner it. So what went into that decision, and is it something you imagine continuing with your rest of your company?
Yeah, it's a really important question, Simone. And the short answer to your last question is absolutely. We'll continue to commercialize, and in particular in the pediatric oncology segment. And the reason that I'm very comfortable kind of reversing that trend is that the pediatric oncology market is small enough and concentrated enough, and the patients are identified early on in their diagnosis and treatment, such that a commercialization as a process is not as challenging. I don't want to say it isn't challenging, but is not as challenging as other arenas, including adult oncology, where all of those parameters are quite different. So the setup for us as a potential commercial entity here in the U.S., I think, was very addressable by a small company, and that certainly made a difference as far as our decision to commercialize on our own. The other element is a strategic element, and that is that many small companies, as you know, are acquired or partner before they actually have to commercialize, and that's often a result of inbound interest from large companies who are looking for revenue growth and for de-risked programs. And my observation, having been a participant in those transactions on both sides for most of my career, is that it's really important for small companies to continue investing and building value, whatever stage they are, in anticipation of what's next. Because those deals are never certain. And in particular, you have to be in a position where you can continue to build value regardless of whether you're bought or not. And that's the approach that we took with Day One and will continue to take in our history and our growth. It's really, in my mind, the way I think about it and communicate it both internally and externally is that our goal is really to build a sustainable business, and someone may come along and shift us away from that, but it really needs to be part and parcel of how we operate and how we plan our activities, including commercialization.
Well, that's really interesting. We will pick up on a little bit more. We're going to take a very brief break. When we come back, we'll talk about building out the pipeline, and I want to get into some precision medicine things as well.
Great.
This September in Nashville, BioCentury launches Grand Rounds, a new interdisciplinary R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia. Join BioCentury and a rich roster of innovators and key thought leaders to identify leading-edge discoveries and discuss urgent challenges that must be solved to translate these innovations into product development and medical practice. Meet academic innovators, physician scientists, early-stage investors, and biopharma R&D leaders for 2 days of networking, partnering, and debate. Register at BioCenturyGrandRounds.com.
We are back at the BioCentury Show with Jeremy Bender from Day One. Jeremy, at Day One, you have a deal with Foundation Medicine. You've developed a companion diagnostic for your first program, at least. And I wanted to think a little bit about the precision strategy that seems to be a thread across your pipeline, certainly your early one, get into some of that, and understand to what degree the partnership with Foundation Medicine is part of that strategy and how much it plays into selecting programs or targets that you work on.
So the Foundation Medicine partnership that we have is really integral to the program that we have for Ogenda and really developing a companion diagnostic that allows for the prospective identification of, in this case, low-grade glioma patients, children who have tumors that are driven by BRAF alterations, and that's really critical both with respect to launching an eventual diagnostic, but also to regulatory requirements with the FDA that we actually have that diagnostic in place in a reasonable time frame. I would say writ large, the way I think about oncology development and Day One's role in oncology development is that we will continue to focus on targeted agents, and by targeted, what I really mean is agents where we can prospectively define a patient population that has a marker on the tumor that allows us to directly target that tumor and potentially enrich for response and get a higher probability of early success in our clinical activity. Often that means that we need to do some diagnostic work in parallel with some of those early clinical studies. I anticipate that, by the way, for our latest program, the ADC that we brought in. But I think that overall strategy is important to us. We are not in a circumstance or our strategy is not going to be one where we're going after all comers within a given tumor in the absence of some strategy around selecting for prospectively at some point in pivotal studies in particular, patients who are most likely to respond and achieve clinical benefit. Going forward, we haven't selected specific partnerships with Foundation or others for a broad approach to that diagnostic strategy, but it is going to be integral to everything that we do.
So we'll come back to some of the other agents in your pipeline in a minute, but just staying with this strategy, because I want to map this back onto what you said about pediatric drug development. Now, pediatric drug development is hard, right? Not only because of consent, you have parents as well as children, safety is very high, and you yourself talked about the populations are smaller. So there is a sort of, I don't know if it's a cognitive dissonance or a tension between a very small population and the idea that you're going to segment those with precision approaches that might make that even harder. Can you talk about how you see that tension within the selection of your programs?
Yeah, so we see it quite clearly. That tension is real, and it leads to circumstances where it can be challenging to invest solely in a specific pediatric indication that might have a very, very small number of patients available to it as a program, as a standalone investment. And that means that what we typically think about when we look at new programs is where a specific program may be applicable, not just in one specific indication within pediatric oncology, but maybe multiple. And then beyond that, where could it be applicable in adults? So we have a couple of programs that fall into that category of agents that have the potential to be beneficial, not just in selected pediatric oncology patients, but also in adult populations. That includes our research stage VRK1 program. VRK1, that program is a program where the target is applicable to a broad range of, in particular, brain tumors and some other tumors that cuts across a number of different histologies within both pediatric and adult populations. And in the absence of multiple populations there, it would be challenging to invest in that program. So that's how we approach it. With the program we just brought in, the ADC that targets PTK7, That's an antigen that we think we can target using an ADC approach in both pediatric populations, that's neuroblastoma, rhabdomyosarcoma, osteosarcoma, but also in adult populations, which include a number of squamous cell carcinomas, lung, gastric, head and neck, and other tumors like ovarian cancer. So it's really a broad-based approach. In the end, from a business standpoint, we have to be looking at programs where there is a business opportunity with the investment that we make. And though in our first program, OJEMDA, low-grade glioma on its own stands as an independent business opportunity that we're convinced can drive a lot of growth for us, both now and in the future. That isn't true for many or even most pediatric indications. So in future programs, you're going to see that we'll focus not just on those pediatric indications, but on adult indications that provide greater upside, frankly, in the commercial setting.
Right. So I'll talk a little. I have a couple of follow-ups on some of those specific targets. So I'm not sure if you mentioned your MEK1/2 inhibitor, which is now in trials in combination with OJEMDA, right? And
I didn't, but that's another important component of the portfolio as well. We brought in that MEK inhibitor from Merck KGaA
right.
and developed that and are developing that in combination with tovorafenib with OJEMDA in adolescent and adult patients that have solid tumors. We're likely to have data on that, and we'll push that data out in the second half of this year. But that's another strategy that we've employed really specifically to maximize the value in adolescent and adults in combination with OJEMDA.
Right. And so then, going back to the other ones for me, MEK1 and 2 and RAF, these are not particularly novel targets. We talked about that. Yep. Your more recent ones, the VRK1 you licensed from Sprint. Correct. And your PTK7 targeted ADC. I can't remember if it has a name. Is it day 301?
Yes.
Day 301, right?
Until we have to give it a long, impossible to name antibody drug conjugate title.
I have no doubt you will give it one of those eventually, but
I'm confident as well.
Yes, and so that you licensed from Mabcare, right?
Yes.
China-based biotech, and these are less established targets. I mean, there are others going after them, and so they have more first-in-class potential. So how are you thinking about? You've got so many other things that you're considering in your in your portfolio in terms of the pediatric population and the target. But how are you thinking about first-in-class and best-in-class as you weigh up these new opportunities?
Well, I think that what I would emphasize, Simone, is that we really do look at programs, and they have to be either first or best in class. And the investment profile for us that's most attractive is relatively straightforward, although fairly rare for us to find because we don't have internal research. So, our programs are really in-licensed, so we compete with others to bring those in. And the criteria for those are pretty straightforward. We need programs that are developable and have real interesting biology in both pediatric and adult patient populations. That tends not to restrict us too much with respect to the scope of programs that we could go after. Most of the targets out there have some development potential in both adults and pediatrics. Beyond that, what we really look for is programs that have characteristics where we think we can have an early development win. A hypothesis we can test in early clinical trials that puts us in a position that we're going to be potentially the first to data with a given target and with a given program, or in some circumstances, potentially not first, but have a story that we think is going to be better than the data that's already out there. It's relatively straightforward, but it's all based on that clinical profile and whether we think we can be differentiated, and in particular, whether we think we can develop rapidly. That rapid development strategy is going to be important as well.
Right. Well, the most recent one, your Mabcare program, is an ADC. The others had all been small molecules, right? And reading what you've written about it, it seems that you believe you can iterate on the ADC. Maybe the linker, maybe the payload, maybe the antibody. And so my question really is whether moving to ADCs, which is a very different modality, requires you to build up a different level of expertise from what you've got supporting your first 3 programs. Did you feel like a need to be in the ADC space because everybody's in there right now? Or?
Yeah. So the answer is yes. We absolutely will need to build additional capability in order to operate in the ADC field. That's particularly true on the CMC side. The good news on manufacturing ADCs is that much of that capability can be accessed through CMOs and external partnerships, and that's largely what we're planning to do and have done really in the diligence process for bringing that program in. I think beyond that, it's also the case that an ADC and the solid tumor arena in particular have a different level of competitive intensity than other small molecule fields that we've been in, notably pediatric oncology, where in low-grade glioma, we've really been the key player and pretty much the only major player investing focused in that area. What I see in the program that we have for PTK7 that's so interesting and exciting is the potential for a first and best-in-class program. And that's because we do see some clinical validation for the PTK7 target as an ADC target from experience that was previously, clinical experience that was previously published by Pfizer and AbbVie from a Stemcentrx program that was put in place. That ADC had an auristatin-based payload, and our view is likely that payload limited the therapeutic index, and so even though they saw some efficacy in a number of tumors that was encouraging, the safety signals were such that they decided to discontinue it. With that as a setup, having a state-of-the-art or potentially state-of-the-art program, the one from MabCare that we've been licensed, that has a DAR8, which is really ideal, as well as an exatecan-containing linker payload system that really is stable.
Just to let everyone know, you're talking about a drug-antibody ratio.
Oh, pardon. Yeah.
Just to get some terminology. Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification. But that system, I think, is really optimized for targets that may have slightly lower cell surface expression on tumors than some of the historical targets like HER2, which is extraordinarily abundant on tumor cells. And our thesis is that with that optimized both antibody, linker, and payload in the Day 301 program, that we may see a better therapeutic index that allows us to really have a best-in-class program, but also a first-in-class program, because there really aren't many other programs that are targeting PTK7 in the clinic today.
Yeah, there's two or three, and as you point out, one of them is actually a bispecific ADC, I think. So
That's right.
we sort of have our own way that and everybody does actually, about first in class and best in class. But I want to now just circle back to day one as a company and where you want to take it. And you mentioned right now that your strategy has been one of in-licensing programs. For our audience, we at BioCentury, we refer to that as an asset-centric approach, as distinct from a platform one, where we call a platform is something that could generate an ongoing line of therapeutic candidates. So an in-licensing strategy is, you get to pick them, as it were. Yep. But you're dependent on those deals. Now, do you think that growing day one, you talked about a sustainable company, do you expect to keep that in licensing strategy core? I often wonder, how big can you grow with that rather than your own engine?
It's a really,
what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, it's a really important question. The first is that I think philosophically, we are an asset-centric organization and company, and I hope that we will always remain so. It's my view that if you look at value and success in our industry, it's almost invariably dependent on products that are approved and new medicines that get to patients, and that's our core mission. And so regardless of whether someday we also have a technology platform that can generate new, clinical candidates, I anticipate that we'll always be asset-centric on some level. You're right to point out that growth, long-term growth in particular, can be challenging if you become a fully fledged FIPCO, so to speak, fully integrated pharmaceutical company, without having some core research that can generate new programs. So that may be in the future for us, but it isn't in the immediate term. Right now, the portfolio is full enough with programs that we can generate really interesting clinical data with, that will continue with our in-licensing strategy. And at some stage, if it makes sense and we see the right platform that's available, either through an acquisition or a licensing a partnership, or through organic growth, we may go into that realm.
I could talk a lot more about that, but I'm going to end because we only got a couple of minutes. And I want to end by asking about life as a CEO. You and I knew you before you were a CEO. Now I know you as a CEO, but you are one, and I know several of these of, one of several pharma executives who've gone on from pharma to head smaller biotechs. Of course, in your case, you'd previously been in a biotech, so you were coming back to the world of small companies. But just, to what degree did that stint at Gilead, to the time you had there and your tenure there, to what degree did that inform your experience as a CEO? What did you learn that you've taken with you, and what were the surprises?
Great question. I think it's quite valuable for CEOs of small companies in particular to have experiences at both large and small companies alike. And that's because the operating environment and the resources that you have available to you as CEO of a small company are quite restricted relative to large companies. So that small company experience is quite valuable. And just as importantly, the large company experience can be quite valuable in understanding what good should look like for larger programs that are commercial stage or can reach a commercial stage. Having an upfront and close view of decision-making in that environment, I think, is really critical. I think the exposure you get to regulatory process in those large settings is also quite important. So those experiences and to a large extent, the network and the relationships that come along with them are invariably, valuable and important as you sit in a CEO chair at a small company and have to make a lot of both small and large decisions that can either lead to success or failure, right? That there's a lot of challenge in what we do, and so much can go wrong that having as much exposure to others' judgment is as useful as anything is in this industry. And for that reason, those big company stints are really useful.
Well, Jeremy, that's a great place to end it. We are, I'm afraid, out of time, but I really look forward to continuing the conversation with you and seeing how day one unfolds. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks, Simone. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury and Insights partner McKinsey & Company this September in Nashville for an R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia.